Welcome to the Coast Division of the NMRA-PCR Saturday Meetup, recorded July 14th, 2020, 9 to 11 p.m. This is kind of our July event updates for the rest of the month. July 11th, we're actually going to have two different things. 9 to 10, we're going to have the PCR Achievement webinar that just got announced with Frank, Earl, and Mike. So basically, how to meet the goals of becoming an MMR through the achievement. It's a different Zoom meetup address. I'll send that out when I send out the video of this meeting. And I will send something, I assume we'll send something else from Chris again. But just so everybody notices, the Zoom meetup for that's actually not the same one for this one we've been doing on Saturdays. So next Saturday, it'll be a different Zoom meetup at 9 to 10. And then there's been this thing going on kind of out of the central region, around having different divisions meet up together and having some folks present. So set up that we're going to be able to participate on the Coast Division in one next week with basically 10 to 12. So Joe Fugate's going to talk a bit about, his line and what he did when he went to rebuild his second layout. And then learning about creating detailed cypress trees, which I look forward to because I always think learning how to build great trees is a great skill set. So that will be from 10 to 12. So next July 11th, we'll have a fairly full morning content. The 18th is another NMRX all-day session. As I understand it, I don't have any details on that yet, but it's in the calendar as on the 18th. So at this point, I'm not planning on having any separate activities on the 18th. The other thing I put up here, even though it's not generally something everybody goes to, we will have a Coast Division board meetup on July 20th. And the reason I put that on here is if anyone would like to come to the board meeting that's not currently in a role in the Coast Division or group organization, whatever you want to call it, it's an opportunity to come kind of talk about things. What we're really going to do is probably spend most of that talking about what kind of activities we want to do as a division over the next 3 to 6 months as we go forward. We've talked about having some outdoor activities or something like that. And then we'll plan on a normal Coast Division Saturday meetup. The replication of this actual meeting will not happen again until July 27th. In those intermediate weeks, we have different things happening on the 11th to 18th. And then, by the way, just so we don't have a huge number of folks, but any feedback about what works, what doesn't work, what you'd like to have for the future, any comments, be appreciated. I'm kind of, originally when we started this, I was kind of doing it on the assumption we do it for a month or two. As we talked about earlier, there's kind of every indication that the kind of level where we're at today is going to continue for at least the foreseeable future, the next couple of months. So my assumption is we're probably going to end up doing this through August and into September. So I'm kind of just looking for any feedback about things that people think would be different, timing, types of events, presentations, discussions, etc. So that was really all I had. Any comments, thoughts, questions?
Phil?
Yes, sir.
I did not receive an email invite to today's meeting. I wonder if anybody else had the same problem.
I sent an email out. I thought I sent an email out yesterday. If you didn't get it, then I have to check my email. I will check my email list. I think
I saw an email from a couple of weeks ago that mentioned this meeting.
I sure thought, hang on. I'm going to be.
Hey, by the way, on your list there, you got the 27th for our next meetup. Isn't that a Monday?
Oh, maybe it's the 28th. You're right. I did bad math, didn't I?
Yeah, it should be on the 25th.
Yeah, that's right. You're right. This should be the 25th, not the 28th. Yep. There we go. Now we're corrected. We're all good. The good news is the only people who saw this was you guys, so I don't feel too guilty.
Is there going to be are you going to put out a link for the multi
Yeah, I'll put an announcement next week. What's going to happen? I think everybody's going to get probably 2 announcements for next Saturday. because the achievement thing is not a Coast Division limited thing. That's really being driven by Chris from a PCR level. And he sent it out as so if you read that, that's a PCR announcement, not a Coast Division announcement. And so it turns out when Chris did that, and because he and I didn't talk, and it's quite funny, my fault completely. We went, that was on a different Zoom account than this one. So that's why there's a difference. So I'll send out an email next week that says, that'll go to the Coast Division that says, for Coast Division members, you're invited to the PCR at 9 to 10, which is this Zoom account, and then from 10 to 11, which will be this Zoom account for the multi-division meeting. And James Knabb, who's actually here, who's from Texas, is actually organizing those. So I thought it was it's kind of a cool opportunity. And then in the future, there potentially the opportunity for us to put together some content as a division if we want to. The other thing, by the way, just as a side, and I know Earl and Frank have had some conversations with them. The NMRA-X, seems to be something they're trying to do fairly regularly, and that's kind of national. So if anyone wants to do a clinic or anything like that at a national level, there are opportunities to do that. I think they're looking for good content. So,
as someone who actually does it, you're correct. They are actually doing that. Gert, or one we commonly refer to as Speed Mueller, and Gordy are always in the hunt for do a different presentation. So if you got one, talk to them.
Exactly. So one of the other nice things about kind of the discussions I've been having with some other folks, I think we can integrate ourselves. One of the nice things is it's kind of almost a roots level integrate discussions between folks of doing things and getting people in contact and learning. So with that, I'm going to introduce Jeff and throw it to Jeff. By the way, Jeff, you should have screen sharing, or do you want me to share the screen? Would you prefer?
No, I got it here.
Cool, that's good. I just never know with folks. So Jeff, I think you got your MMR in 17 or 18. It's fairly couple of years, 17 or 18. And so I'm going to let Jeff introduce himself because quite frankly, I didn't force him to write me a write-up intro, so I'll let him do it and talk a little bit about what he models and that. I was not very professional, but I'll shut up and I'm giving it overall to Jeff. So Jeff, you have control.
Thanks. I'm Jeff Palmer. Yes, I am an MMR. I'm number 620, so if somebody wants to go and look it up, that's who I am. I figure that if nothing else, I've learned mediocrity pretty well. It's a skill set. I mean, if you look at the scoring system, you have 125 points. You have to score 87.5. Now, if you do the straight percentages, that's a C. So I'm mediocre. if you get in there. So if you on like cars and structures and stuff like that, where the scoring system actually comes in to determine whether you're merit or not. But anyway, that's beside the point. What I like is scenery, track work, and building. Those are the things. That's the part of the hobby that interests me the most. There are those who like operations and all the aspects of scheduling and things of that nature. I like to run the trains, but I'm not really one who wants to necessarily do that. Do I need to build a train in a yard and get it ready to go out? Can I? And the answer is yes. Is that the part that I like? No. You'll find that most of the time in an operation system, I'm the guy who volunteers to run the passenger train. And there's a reason for it. The reason is it gets the right of way all the time. And guess what I don't do? I don't have to break down the train and or make it up. I just pull the train and I just meet a schedule. I can do that. But as far as, there are other, like I said, it's just a different skill set, which all that feeds into what I'm getting ready to talk about, which is scenery. Because in scenery, if you stop and think about it, it's what we look at. It's what we see. And that's somewhere down here. I've lost my piece. There we go. And it's one of those things where every one of us can look at the very same object and we will get a different impression of that object. I don't care how it is. I don't care what it is that you're looking at. I've seen people talk about toilets. Now, don't ask me how that came along, but what it was is that there was a shop that had about 4 or 5 different toilets sitting out in the backyard of their shop, like they were going to be disposed of or they were stored. I'm not sure what it was, but grass was growing up around them. And everybody, when you became a point of conversation in the group I was in at a later time, about lunchtime, and everyone had a different impression of what they saw. We are so used to seeing junk, trash, things of that nature. We don't even register it anymore. In fact, we would register it if it's absent. And that's the important thing that you need to remember. We register things sometimes just because they're not there. And on a track or a layout, scenery is what is seen. And if it's what's expected, okay. But if something is missing, then it doesn't have detail. It doesn't have all the raw materials necessary to make what we see register in our mind as being real, prototypical, whatever the word is that you want to use. And so that's kind of where I go with what we're talking about. It's about our vision. It's about our memory. It really does. And every one of us have a slightly different interest. Just like, we were talking about earlier, my interest is in scenery and in track work, whereas yours may be in operations, yours may be in detailing locomotives and trains. Do I fix up and detail my engines? Absolutely. Do I fix up and detail all my cars? No, I got to admit I'm a little lax there. Do I need to? Yeah, they would look more prototypical. They look more real. I mean, let's face it. The day one of those cars rolls out of the manufacturing facility, wherever it happens to be, is the day that the dirt starts piling on, if not before then. Everything is dirty. There is nothing on a railroad that when I go touring around and looking at various facilities and engines, there's nothing clean. It has not been run through a fresh car wash or anything like that to make it look nice and clean. Passenger trains, maybe. Freight trains, never. And my interest is always been in mining and logging. So nothing that I see or look at lends itself to being clean. So I have a friend of mine who says, if it ain't dirty, it ain't done. And he's right to a great extent. Now, some of us carry that to an extreme, but hopefully that's what you should do, is carry to the point to where you're comfortable, what you like, what you see. And so that's basically kind of things that I'm looking at. It's like this scene right here that you got, and I'll pull up on the screen there. If you look at that scene, what do you see? The first thing that's jumped out at me is that has to be an abandoned track. Why does it have to be abandoned? If you look at it, I mean, what makes it abandoned? Hey guys, you take yourself off mute because I do expect participation here. So feel free to jump in. What makes this an abandoned track?
Rusty rails.
On the top.
So the top of the rails are rusty. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how long this track has been abandoned, but it has not been used anytime. The other thing is, look at the roadway that someone built over the track. Because if an engine or any kind of car had been running over this track, that gravel would be crushed on top of the track. I mean, just the little things. It gives you the feeling, but at one time it's obviously, look at the tower to the left of the track. Did you notice the graffiti by the door? It basically says, come in, it's open or whatever. But I mean, it's the weeds are growing up. It's basically an unkempt area. It was heavily used at one time, and the reason we know it's heavily used at one time is that we look down the middle of the track, it's black. Oil, maybe in the past even coal cinder material along there. You don't see it so much along the sides, which I would expect to see with a steam engine era, but with a diesel era, down the middle, oil and other materials get dripped all the time. And so if you look down through there, it's what you see. Now, I'm not doing anything, I'm not bringing out anything that you probably don't see, but the point really is that we have to take notice. If there are things missing and you were modeling this and you had the picture, I mean, we could be able to do a direct comparison. In fact, the best scenery tool you got is probably in your pocket, and that's your pocket, finds your cell phone with the camera. Take pictures of all kinds of stuff. I mean, you think it's inconsequential? I take pictures of graffiti on the walls. It's interesting to see how graffiti has transitioned, or the other word that people like to use, has evolved over the years. Of course, now the second tool to put with your camera is Google Images, and get in there and look at some of the stuff that goes on with Google Images. It's it's an education that you can get and train yourself on being able to see the little details, to see the things that make sure that you actually add to your layout to give it that quote unquote realism. If you ever look at a layout such as, well, Joe Fugates had one. You're going to see him in a week or so. The Susquehanna line was done very well. And the second one, I have not seen his new layout or how it's coming along, but the first one was well detailed. But you run into George Celios, or you run into Dave Ferrera, you run into some of the other people who have very detailed layouts. And it didn't happen overnight. It's just one of those things that, like they were talking about, it evolved. And essentially, like, they came along, they built a structure, put it out there, it met their needs and thought about it. And then when they came back a little while later, it says, it's missing something. And they started figuring out what it was. It might have been some trash. How about a junk pile here and there? How about something that's a broke down tractor, or maybe a truck or a car? How about something rusted? It was one of those things that all that process evolves, and that's basically what we're talking about and looking here. Here's a hump yard.
Hey, Jeff, on
Yes,
that
sir.
previous slide, the other thing that really pokes, that I saw, is the variegated ground cover colors. And that's what you don't see on a lot of people's layouts. You've got, the light colored gravel by the track. You have that kind of a black area. The roads an intermediate color. Even that concrete tower is a couple different colors. And most people, when they do scenery and ground cover, everything's pretty much one color.
And you're exactly right. And that's a very good point. Thanks for catching that. Because if you look at it, you've got the dark colors, the blacks, the browns, all around the track area there. But look over there in front of the tower. It's got a brownish tint to it. So there's a different composition of the rock and the stone that was used for the ballast on that other track. And you kind of go look back towards the hills.
So probably, so in all probability, maybe this may have been the mainline track, and that may have been a spur, which may have actually had different ballasting potentially.
Definitely.
It was interesting. Is a lot of times when they did reballasting, they just reballasted the main line. They didn't necessarily reballast the spur next to it. And if they changed ballast, I mean, it's interesting is I got some stuff from Western Pacific where they actually show the origin of the ballast on the track at different miles. So you can go in a book and you can see the ballast in this area came from here. And so as they put new ballast in over time from different places, it would change it. Because if you look here, you can almost see the different variation from the gray to the brown there, on the right side of the main track there. And that almost looks like maybe there was some other ballast or something at one time, or maybe that's just total dirt. But it's a real, I think, Earl, you made a great point, which is, you got to have like 3 variations of anything, kind of the base and darker and lighter, and kind of mix it around to get it to look like a real environment.
Yeah, see, the other thing I liked about this picture was the vine that was growing up that tower. I mean, sometimes we don't see a lot of climbing vines. And so basically that becomes regional somewhat. And also, but it's an interesting detail that could be added to a structure or any building as far as that goes, especially in the more rural settings that would add interest. And that's one of the things we're always trying to do, is add interest to our layout. But yeah, that was a great catch. Thank you, Earl. And also notice a little, it looks like I'm not sure what kind of hut that is off to the main line that's going down through there. It's between the signal tower and the I'm assuming that's probably one of the switching areas there for that signal tower, and holding the some of the mechanics and electronics for it, but I don't know that.
The little it's a phone booth, I think.
It's what it looks like.
Yeah.
Could definitely be just a phone booth, but like I said, not sure exactly what it is, but it's one of those things, like I said, you put things in places to draw interest, because it was one of the things that caught my interest. Like I said, the tower to the left caught my interest on that picture, as well as, like I said, the first thing I saw was the red-orange of the top of the rails. And, you immediately know that means that track hasn't been run in a while. I mean, but yeah, it's true.
So just a question for anyone. So if that is a phone box, phone booth, whatever you want to call it, it's clearly not there, I wouldn't think, for general, call it for lack of a better word, consumer use. It seems to me it had to be put there for a railroad function. Were those used like in a location like this, where there might be somebody to tell somebody to stop to wait for orders? Was that what?
Yeah, they're typically built like almost like a vault. They're made out of concrete, and the door is a heavy steel door. And once that door is locked, not the typical person cannot get in there without a key. They're really designed for security.
But I guess the question is, were they used like for crew communication? Or my assumption would be that that's what that had to be for, was a remote location where you wanted to have a communication point where a train could stop and communicate. I was trying to think about why that would be there. It's just a very interesting thing.
Frequently, your operating instructions would say that when you get to this point, you have to call the dispatcher.
Right, and maybe that's that was actually a call the dispatcher blocked. Either your orders said wait there and call to get proceeding, or maybe there was a light that told you should stop and get instructions. It's an interesting. I had never seen that before. I mean, we have these things where you stop at a point and you get instructions from the dispatcher when you're operating on somebody's layout. But the idea that there was a phone booth there, or a place that you had to stop and the conductor had to go to there and get on the phone or do whatever to interact with someone is a pretty interesting thought process, because it kind of, yeah.
One other thing that strikes me about this picture, and it's just an overall thing, is the color saturation. Those of us that live in California are used to a much different palette.
This is clearly it's clearly the anion, it's the Eastern Mountains.
Yeah. Eastern Mountains.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was watching a YouTube video, and it was filmed in California, and then all of a sudden the guy switched to Colorado without saying anything. It was one of these things of, in California, but then all of a sudden there were some scenes, and it was like instantly you could tell you were no longer in California by the shape of the mountains and the vegetation. You immediately knew that and light. And this actually is exactly the same way. I mean, this just immediately tells you, because the density of the density and color saturation, where you are.
So if you create a scene similar to this on your railroad, how do you fix the scenery? Do you overspray it with a glue mixture? What do you do?
I'm not sure exactly what you're going with. You're going to put down the ballast like you would always put down the ballast in the dirt, just like you always would. You're going to have I use alcohol as my wetting agent. I don't use water with detergent in it. It's a personal choice. I'm not going to get into the politics of water versus alcohol, but you can take it either. You can use either, but you're going to set your ballast and your dirt and things of this nature. I also, everybody here familiar with someone named Lou Sassy? He's an author. When I first was getting back into the hobby, I spent 10 years or more with my son and RC cars. And so there was a period of time when I went from trains to children to back to trains. And so during my children era, my son was in RC cars. And one of the things that we got to do was travel around and go to various meets because he was really good at it, at RC cars. And I was the mechanic. We would find things that would, like this, that would say, okay, the grass that's standing up, that to me is a definite way of putting on static grass. I mean, I could do that with, you do something similar with that with static grass without having to plant each and every one of it. But what you do is you put a drop of scenery glue, and you literally put a drop. Everything else is dry. You put a drop of scenery glue, and then you hit that with static grass. Then the grass dries because it will seep down into the ballast or into the dirt. But getting back to what I was also, my ground always has texture because I learned to use something that Lou Sassy put in one of his books called ground goop, and basically it's paint and vermiculite and some other material. We all kind of mix together. And you paint it on the ground, and what it does is it gives the ground a texture. It's not flat like paint. One of the things that people miss in preparing things is that a lot of what we see, we see the color, but it's the texture. Rust. I mean, could I lay down some orange red paint and make the top of the rails that color? Yes. Would it have the same effect as me seeing rust on there? And the answer to that is no. But if I go back and I put a texture with that, whether it's a very fine ground chalk is probably the best thing I can think of. Go over the top of that with some chalk while the paint is drying. It adds that texture look and the roughness, the unevenness associated with rust. And if you've ever seen rust will rot a piece of iron in layers. Now, iron is not a layered material. It's because it's molten when it's built, and therefore. But if you look at rust will layer that with the different kinds of levels of rust, whether the heavier rust, the darker rust, the things that we think of as being there longer, whereas the more orange rust is lighter. I mean, even on the track, you see it. You see more of I'm calling it a brownish rust along the sides of the rails, where you have that bright orange on the top. Therefore, some of that rust has been there much longer than some of the rest. It's going back, and I had to teach myself to look. Believe it or not, and I'm still teaching myself to look. As my wife will tell you, I don't notice enough. I'm better at it now than I used to be. But like I said, the best tool for any of this is your cell phone, because it's got a camera on it. Something sort of strikes your interest, you kind of go, oh, that's kind of neat. Just take a picture of it. And later on, it may not be as neat as you thought it was, and you just delete the picture. But I mean, it's not like you have to have it developed anymore, and it costs money. I mean, you got your cell phone, and you got the memory already on the phone. You might as well use it. But yeah, the phone booth, I thought that was an extremely interesting touch. By
the way, guys, I'm just, as a comment on what Jeff just said, I'm actually doing, that Moss Landing module. I went and took a bunch of pictures in down at Moss Landing of kind of the shoreline and how the dirt is and how it comes down to the water. And I just basically took a bunch of those and printed them out in 3 8.5 by 11 sheets. And I'm using those as I go through and do the modeling. When Jeff gets done, I'll show you a picture of kind of what I'm doing there. But it's interesting. I'd never done that before. I always kind of looked at things and model them how I thought they should look. And it's really interesting how different, Earl, I know you probably do this all the time, so it's probably not a surprise, but how much having some pictures just helps you kind of refill in what your brain didn't remember. Our brain, it's interesting, my brain remembers what I'm interested in, not what I would really see if I really looked at it critically. It's kind of interesting, right? So if my interest is in this, like signaling, I look at this and I see the signal first and then everything else. If I'm going back to look at, if I went there and walked around, if you go back a year later and you're trying to recreate in your mind what you saw, it's pretty hard to take away that what you saw predominantly was a signal. You didn't really see the way the vines were laying on the building. What I've realized is that my memory is very good for things that I pay attention to in any scene, not very good for everything else.
And you tend to miss a lot also because you're focused, say, just on the signal.
Right,
And you miss
exactly.
all the other details.
Exactly, and that's why what I realized was I had this thing of always saying, why you do a scene till it looks good to you, but I realized you're only looking at that scene one-dimensionally. When other people look at it, they don't see it from the same view as you. So the nice thing about this is, and Jeff, I think it's a really good point, is you take the time to look at it from different perspectives. Whether you're doing a prototype scene, or even if you're doing freelance, to take pictures of the area to get the concepts of that variation. It's pretty interesting. It's an interesting thought process. Very good.
Yeah, like I said, this particular picture is actually from Pennsylvania, in case anybody is curious. I work with a group called that does the Fine Scale Miniatures Expo, and so we, like Scranton, in this particular one here, is that I was going up towards the loop, the Hatchery Loop, in I'm sorry, the Hatchery's in there. My mind is Horseshoe Curve. Anyway, we're up in the because I was up by Scranton. And we were just touring around, and this was one of those pictures. I did not actually get to see the phone building up close. I would like to have done it, so I made some assumptions about it, which may be totally wrong, and I hadn't even thought about it being used for dispatching, because it makes absolute sense, good sense, that that's exactly what it would be for. If somebody had to come in and get orders, the stop and send the conductor or the fireman off to, or as far as that goes, even the engineer, go up and go make a phone call, phone home, and get what he's supposed to be, doing next. Because maybe there is, I'm assuming that at one time this was probably part of the main line, and there was the secondary track over there was for something else. It could be totally reversed. I don't know. But anyway, the photo was from Pennsylvania, just an FYI, as is the next one.
Hey, Jeff, one question. The show you're talking about, that's a Craftsman Structure show, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Scotty Mason started off as the Craftsman show, and then
Jimmy Deegan took it over.
Yes, and became the Fine Scale Modelers Expo, FSM, and named after Cellulos's Fine Scale Models, which we used to tease him about that one. But yes, it very much was. And like I said, they haven't had a get together in a couple of years now, and so I'm getting a little concerned, because they canceled the one for last year, and then this year's obviously not going to have one for all the appropriate reasons. But while I was in the Pennsylvania area, I came across a hump yard, and the first thing you see is here is the arresters. But coming off of the feeder lines coming in, it's not a giant hump yard like you see over in Fort Worth or some of the other places that you can go and look at. I'm sorry, I'm from Texas also, so Fort Worth is is a neighbor almost. I mean, I live in Dallas, and so Fort Worth. And when people talk about the Metroplex area, that's the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And so we have a very large hump yard over there for BNSF. And and so this one here, I look at it. It's a minor hump yard, and you can see, but you can look at the structures. You can see how someone would, if you were going to build a hump yard, this would give you ideas of what's there. Look at all the trash. Now, that was one of the reasons I took the picture, is like, okay, this is wintertime, so you have grass that has died. Look at these tracks over to the left there, just to the right of this cable car or a tank car like structure, and that's all dead grass. This is not it's not necessarily a well-kept area, but it's a well-used area, because you can see all the traffic behind in the hump yard itself, the cars and stuff that are being or that are waiting to be made up. But I like the arrestor tracks. I like all of the debris that you see there, and the fact that it's a foggy day, it's an overcast day, so yeah, and that's the way it was. Look to the right by the phone lines there, to the right hand side of the picture. The power units and stuff that were sitting there, so the transformers that are driving all of the various pieces of equipment need to make up the hump yard to make it usable. The little tower here, I'm not sure exactly what those are, but my guess are they're like, that's like a relay unit for being able to drive the switches. Do I know that? Absolutely no, because I did not get to go up in the tower. To the left here, if you look down at the lower portion, there is some kind of dugout thing down here. There is something buried here, because I mean, they built a platform over it and they put a hatch over it, so they want it protected. But what is it? I don't know. But my guess is that there would be, again, a mechanical mechanism of some sort. It looks like it could even possibly be, electronic or electrical. Electronic. That's not bad choice of terms. No transistors are necessary or integrated circuits, but something that would help them in assisting in throwing the tracks or being able to get the turnouts to switch to the right locations. I mean, there are a number of them. The phone lines going down to those are more than likely not phone lines, but actually power lines driving the various motors and machines necessary to make up all of the trains that are in this yard, to allow them to do all of the functions of the railroad. Like I said, I am not an operator, so anytime you guys want to jump in here with the right words, feel free, because I'm getting into the vocabulary portion of this that I'm not as familiar with as I would be talking about scenery and shrubs and grasses and weeds and stuff like that. But and yes, there are a difference between all of those. But
So I assume that thing in the center there, that's actually must be a big light stanchion.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It is a very large light stanchion, and yes, it also had microwave equipment on it. You can't see it, but further up you'll see some. If I had, I mean, I can only get so much in the shot.
Oh.
But if you look further up, there were microwave units on that, which would make sense, because keep in mind, microwave is line of sight. You stick something between in a microwave path, for lack of better terms, you will interfere with the signal. I mean, it is line of sight. My world is, I'm IT. I did 50 years of IT, as well as the last 25 years of being a professor at a local college. So anything that's had any height in it at all, as we begin the internet revolution, for lack of better terms, where we were sending lots and lots of data and lots of signals, everything that's tall, like this tower here, will have a microwave unit on it somewhere.
I actually have a friend who, back 35, 40 years ago, when microwave first started for data transmission, went and lined up all the hilltops from San Francisco to LA. Worth a lot more money than any of us now.
Oh yeah.
Basically lined up because that's the microwave. There's a microwave network now down the center of the state, and it runs on the hilltops. What's interesting is with the railroads, so they must have used that then to send information to here from somewhere else. So this probably then, depending on the railroad, this would probably be back in the 60s or so. When was this shot?
Oh, actually, it was shot about 10 years ago.
Okay, because the interesting thing is that most of them had communications on the railroad later, where they actually ran it. So this would bring in, I mean, it's an interesting thought process to think about how they brought communications in here to this, because clearly what happened was they had to provide information here to the hump yard in terms of how to switch the cars and where to switch them to, right? Because the cars have an identifier, but the cars don't carry with them a destination. That has to be given. So basically, the data has to come to here to say these cars are coming these are the trains to sort them to, and then that feeds into this system to decide where they go.
Well, that was my first thought about these little things right here. They could have very, very well been, for lack of better terms, barcode readers.
Right.
Remember
Yeah.
the colored barcodes and stuff like that
Yep.
that are on the sides of cars at this point. And think about the electronics that have to go saying, okay, he read the number. Now he's got to switch it to the appropriate tracks.
Yeah.
Um,
Which is why it wouldn't be there, because there's really not a lot of
Yeah.
time domain between when you would read it and when you would have to flip the switch. By the way, the only reason I say that is because I put Wabbits in, and they've got that little track that'll detect that the switch is thrown the wrong way and throw the switch so it doesn't short the track of a train coming in against the switch and short it.
oh yeah.
And it turns out you have to put those back about 4 or 5 inches before the frog, or you don't allow enough time for it to throw. So it actually turns out the electronic sensing has to have enough time domain to actually impact where it throws to. But it's really interesting to think of. I've actually found hump yards. I think a hump yard would be a really interesting thing to try to figure out how to do effectively.
Yes, I agree with you. And one of the reasons I took the picture of it is I'm kind of going, can I build one? And if I did, I mean, the arrestor tracks right here, the arrestor sections, I'm sitting there kind of going, okay. I mean, I could model it as a dummy.
So there's a guy that did a very interesting thought process, and it was an HO. So by the way, I would argue that it's a lot easier to do it in larger scales than in smaller scales, because mass, which is 3 dimensions, is actually critical to this, because you're dealing with mass and how fast something's moving and slowing it down. So having the more mass you get in O or G makes it a lot easier in HO. But there was a guy who did one in HO, and it seems to me what he did was he put brush fingers that came up underneath, and you could do something pretty interesting. If you had 3 like relays or three or 4 with brush fingers on them, you could detect the speed of the car, and you decide how many brush fingers to lift depending on the speed, and they would just wipe along the bottom of the car and slow it down as it went by. I mean, you've got to figure out, it's an interesting thought. It's a really interesting engineering problem to figure out how to make it work.
Yeah, it is. And like I said, it was one of those things that I'm just kind of going, okay, it's one of those projects you kind of put on the back table, back burner, and you kind of go, okay, as I develop skills over time, then I can maybe at some point be able to address it. But anyway, like I said, again.
By the way, being a narrow gauger, it's something you get to completely ignore.
That's absolutely true. The other thing is that I liked here was the limitation of ballast. Look at those ties. It's almost like we do a narrow gauge, which is basically a narrow gauge. Almost all of our track was laid on dirt. And maybe somebody threw in a couple of shovelfuls of dirt between the ties from time to time. But look at the ties. Yeah, I mean, this is setting up. They have a little bit of ballast around them, but in comparison to what we're used to seeing on our main lines, or even further down into the yard itself, they're pretty exposed. But it's just like I said, it's one of those things.
That's actually a really interesting question. Does anybody know when they build yards, and I'm sure this must change over time, was it pretty much did they do a sub bed before they put ties down? So if you look at not so much back in the history of the past, but today if you're putting a track down, they basically grade the dirt, then they put a level of rock, then they put the ties on that level of rock, and then they put more ballast around the ties to hold them in place. So the ties are actually sitting on a layer of rock of ballast.
Yes.
I wonder if they do that in yards. It's just, and by the way, it's just a question that, in other words, if I was building this yard when this yard was built 80 years ago, did we just come in and level the dirt, put the ties on the dirt, throw some rock to level up to the edge of the ties so people would walk around and call it a day? Or did they level the dirt and then on the whole yard put down 6 inches or 3 inches or 8 inches of rock and then put the track down on that and then re-level it up. Because normally what you see in a yard is that the ballast is up to the level of the ties and kind of level between the tracks. It doesn't come down. It's not, there's not the berm level like there is on the main line. It's flat. And it's a curious question about how and I'm just actually more interested because if you invested in the rock underneath, the argument would be the argument for the rock under the ties is you drain the water away from the ties. The ties are wood, therefore they last longer. But if you look at a whole yard, would they do that? It's just a curious question. Just it probably has nothing to do with modeling because it doesn't matter. I just thought it was an interesting thought process of.
I think you're going to find there's an evolution over time. What you've seen stuff done in the last 20, 30 years, they've paid a great deal of attention to actually doing proper infrastructure.
Underlayment.
Earlier periods, they didn't.
Yep. So you're probably right. So if you're doing something in the 20s or 30s, most of those, they just laid the stuff right on the dirt, leveled it, and then later they started getting it up out of the dirt.
Yes.
Interesting. Sorry, as far as the diversion, it's just always interesting thought processes.
As you can tell, I like engine facilities and things of that nature. In case you hadn't, it goes back to my logging and mining kind of stuff. So here is another one that I liked. It's again in the Pennsylvania area, and it has to do with the debris. Look at the ties right there to the left of the engine house or the car house, whichever it is there. Because I'm not sure which one that it is, but I would judge that it's an engine house at one time. And also off to the main time, it gives a good shot of the bar ditch that's often associated with main lines. I like that. Like I said, the debris that's out there, and if anybody ever complains about you putting grass between your ties and around the yards, hey, this is a working facility, and needless to say, they have their vegetation. Notice that those shrubs over there the sticks sticking up, that they have some pretty tall weeds and or bushes that are growing in the yard area. So it's not you can add it to yours and to add interest and things of that nature. And like I said, don't forget the trash. Railroad has trash. If you walk down the middle of, especially around a station or whatever, air hoses between the lying between the rails is not an unusual sight.
It is now.
Well, the ties, the rotted ties, the old ties and or new ties, because remember, they lay out new ties before they get ready to start doing some replacement. But old ties, they don't necessarily go back and clean up the broken tie material associated with having pulled some ties out. Now, some of the modern equipment would normally do that, but not everybody has access to that equipment, and not every, as shown here, because like I said, these photos were all taken within the last 10 years.
So it's Conrail track.
I don't remember, sir. I really don't.
Okay. I just say there were, maintenance issues with large parts of the eastern infrastructure have been for the last 30 years.
I.e. the decline of the railroad.
So those two cars that are sitting there, if you'll go back and say the two cars that are sitting there, it'd be interesting if on your original, if you got it, to look at what those are, because they don't look like box cars. They look like they've got other windows and stuff in them. They look like some sort of maintenance away cars.
Yeah, that one looks like some sort of critter.
Yeah, no, it's just I'm just looking at them, and it's like the back one looks like a boxcar, but it looks to me just in this like it's got some other holes cut in there, and then the yellow one sure looks like it's got something in the front that looks. Those are pretty
that's
interesting.
A critter.
I believe that's exactly what it was.
Yep, that's cool.
But it's.
Well, the front looks like a trolley.
I'm sorry. Anyway, this was supposed to be a fairly short presentation, and I think I'm still on schedule.
It's interactive. It's okay.
Yes.
That's the way I look at it. It's more just, it can be more of a discussion. It's cool.
Yeah, I look at the things that I do when I get ready to do scenery. I create the basic terrain. Yeah. Can you carve foam? Yeah. I use foam and basically plaster cloth because I like the hardness associated with the plaster cloth, but I like the ability to plant things, for lack of better terms, into the foam.
By the way, Jeff, as a side, I do modular. I use a lot of foam. I cover all the foam now with a thin layer of Sculptamold. I bought a 20-pound bag of Sculptamold in one of my orders from Micromark. So you get this burlap bag full of Sculptamold, and you can mix up, and you spread it like almost like cake frosting. Just kind of spread a thin layer out, and then when it after about 2 or 3 hours, when it's still moist underneath, you can rub it and kind of get nice textures in it, and it makes a really nice base. And it solidifies the foam, because we've always had issues with the foam with kids putting their fingers in, and you get depressions. And you don't get that when you put a thin layer of Sculptamold over it. It kind of gives you a hard shell on top of the foam that I really like.
Good. I'll give that a try. Which is the reason I do the plaster cloth kind of thing, which was because to me, if you leaned on it, like maybe you had to reach in to get something, you always had this depression, and that's not always. It's never in the spot where you want it. Yeah, I use like I said, primarily flat colored paints when I'm getting ready to do things. Homosote, Micor, yeah, whichever one you want to do, but you're going to end up painting it all. When I install the track, I put the track down and I go over the track with a coat of flat black. It takes if I'm laying, especially if I'm doing like flex track or anything like that, it takes away the plastic look to start with, and then I can start detailing it. It just provides me with a base. Obviously, you have to clean the track, and I end up rusting the sides of the rails and stuff like that, all the things that you normally would do to detail the track. But it's not a difficult process. But the thing that I always remember, and the things you should see from the pictures, and we talked about it, is the layers that we see, the colors, the blending, all the things that come together to make up that scene. We had different colored ballasts between the siding and what we thought was the old dilapidated main line. We have we have all of the colors associated with adding vegetation, because vegetation grows everywhere. Now, there was a period of time, if you stop and and remember, is that, or ever worked around a yard, what you end up doing is we pump up a big spray unit and pump, one of the hand pump spray units, and we'd go around and hit it with usually diesel oil or something like that. Would go around to kill the vegetation off. Nobody goes around and pulls the weeds. They kill off the vegetation and it just lays there. And so, as we saw in some of that, and there's trash. Like I said, there's all kinds of trash associated, paper, around stations. You're going to find people who threw away schedules. And they didn't throw it in the trash; they throw it on the ground. So, and that ends up being blown around and whatever. In cityscapes, we always see the things like gutters. I don't know about the gutters in where you live. I mean, most of the time they're fairly clean, but there are times when trash gathers, especially around heavily used areas, around major cities. Every time I go to New York City, I'm amazed that the people can live there. But it is part of it's part of the escape. It's part of the things that once you've trained your eyes to see it, you actually ignore it. Okay, one of the things that comes along that I really didn't talk about is like scenery material. There's a list there. I sent a copy of the presentation. I can make it available to anybody else.
I'll put the presentation in the email when I send it out, and I'll put it up on the. I'm going to go ahead and I've got a couple of things. I want to put them up in a folder on the PCRgroups.io page. So I just got to go create a folder in the files there and put them in. So you'll get it 2 different ways.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that happens, people tend to get real cheap with scenery for whatever reason. And I don't have a problem with that. I'm just sitting there saying that if you're one of the people who wants to use natural grass, or natural dirt, and you want to do that, that's okay. But keep in mind that the dirt itself is not a living organism, but it's a place for a lot of other living organisms, including mold. I've had people who actually use grass dirt out of their backyard, out of the garden area. And after about 6 months of it being on their layout, it turned green. And it was not the kind of green that you really want to have hang around. So you want to kill the mold and stuff like that. I'm gonna go through this real quick. But here's the references that I use for a lot of my material. And here's the things I talked about: loose acids, ground goop. That's the formula for it there. And using leaves and dirt, you're going to blend it up, okay? No matter what, you're going to have to break it up. And I will tell you that if your dirt has a lot of clay in it, I'm just going to tell you good luck. Because basically what you're going to end up doing, if you'll put either the leaves and follow what I process here, you'll kill any organisms and or eggs or anything else that happens to be in the dirt. Because I have had a friend of mine's layout who used dirt out of his garden, and he ended up with an infestation of roaches. And so you got to take care of it. It doesn't happen to everybody. It doesn't happen all the time, but does it happen? The answer is yes. Mold and fungus is a natural in dirt. In fact, that's what you want. One of the things that we're doing when we're composting our gardens is that we're adding those kinds of materials, because that's what breaks down the clays and makes it useful. So here's a way of being able to handle some of that and use it. I use a lot of Arizona stone and mineral. They've already done the work for me. It's already blended up. And I will tell you that a small bag goes a very long way. We're not talking about moving in shovel loads of dirt onto our layout. So, don't get too carried away with it. And if you've done the other things to begin the covering of the ground, such as painting the ground some kind of brown or a flat color, it could even be a flat black as far as I'm concerned, and then start spreading on it. It doesn't take a lot of dirt being sifted over whatever board that you have there or whatever foam that you've got in place to cover it. It really does not take a lot. You hit it with a little bit of glue and hit it with a little bit of the dirt, regardless of where you get it from, and you cover it. Because, like I said, we're not going to be digging gardens in it, so it doesn't take a lot.
So Jeff, just an interesting thought on dirt, and I've tried this for the first time. A couple of guys in the modular group I'm in have started using sanded grout as a first layer. Yeah. And I actually tried that, and I've got some pictures I show later. I've tried that with this, because it's real fine sand that you get down by the water's edge. Uh-huh. And it actually works pretty interesting. And the nice thing about it is they have different colors you can buy. So you can actually kind of get it, and it's fine. I mean, one of the things I noticed when I went back and looked at, even in O-scale, at the modules I built, where I went and I got dirt and I sifted it and I did all of that. When I went back and looked at it, you realize that everything's about 1 inch in diameter or larger. And when you look at it, because natural dirt, when you actually sift it, even though you sift it really fine, it's really not that fine. The sanded grout is really fine. So it's really much more like dirt. I'm not convinced it's the right. What I'm doing is doing the grout and then putting another layer of fine dirt kind of sifted on top of it to kind of give it some color variation. but it's an interesting thought process, the grout stuff, I think. So
I have heard about it. I myself have not tried that, so it would be one of those things that'd be interesting to do.
Yeah.
The key phrase, if you're using natural material, is to bake it for about 30 minutes at 200 degrees. That way it kills any living organisms that are normally in there, including eggs. Just an FYI, and you don't do it in a closed oven. You leave the oven with the top. Usually most ovens have the ability to have an open space at the top just before it closes. And it's one of those things where, like I said, it allows you to be a little safer with the material if you're not going to go use somebody else's already processed. Grout, sand, stuff like that you pick up, most of that stuff has already been processed, and you can probably go fairly well with that. Overall, that's basically what the presentation was supposed to be about. Like I said, I hope we didn't get too far along and I didn't miss my timeline by too much. But if I have any other questions, yell at me here.
Thanks, Jeff. That was great. It was great because it was great to have a discussion and have a little interaction, et cetera. So that was absolutely wonderful.
Oh, I appreciate the invitation. Like I said, I can do other presentations if you would like in the future on various other subjects, but this was the one that seemed to fit for this one. I like interactive discussions, so just about anything I do will be interactive. It's not fun just being there talking to yourself. I played the professor thing for 25 years, and there's other ways. There's better ways.
Here, I'm going to share real quickly just for a second. You guys can see. So this is these are just shots I took actually yesterday. So basically, this is water here in the front on both of these. The left one, the water doesn't look quite right because of the lighting. But the right one, you kind of see more of you've got water, and then there's earth. These are actually all, the base level is all the sanded grout. So you've got basically an earth, what they call brown earth or something here, and then this is a lighter tan spray. And basically, this was painted with a white glue mixture, and then I used a sifter and sifted the grout onto it. And then afterwards, you can kind of see up on the top of the grout, and down here, I'm adding in some additional rock of kind of the same color. But yeah, it's the same exact thing that you were talking about in terms of kind of trying to layer it and using it. And then, by the way, underneath this, what you see underneath, that's actually the Sculptamold on foam. So if you look at this, that's basically the sculpt. What you're seeing on the right picture here, that's actually the Sculptamold of the same hill. What you were seeing there on the bottom right, you see that kind of loop here. You were seeing a picture of that from over there. Anyway, just yeah,
Looking good.
That's actually what it looked like with foam ball before the Sculptamold. But anyway, it's I think it's great ideas the way you guys did it. And Gordy's here. By the way, for everybody who's on here, Gordy Robinson joined us here, and Gordy actually runs the NMRA-X. And so, one of the things for folks in the Coast Division, Gordy, if you can put a contact address or something in, if you've got a session you'd like to do in the NMRA-X, send Gordy an email. I'm sure he's looking for folks to come in and do things. We've got some, Earl, some of the things you've done clearly are brilliant. And Gordy, have you talked to Earl and Frank about, I think they've talked to you about what they're doing relative to achievement awards and potentially doing that in the NMRA-X as well?
Have you?
I don't know. So I talked to Frank, and Frank said there was a conversation. Earl, I don't know. I said something to Frank, and he said they'd had a conversation. So we have
Yeah, that was the discussion about how we do AP virtual judging, and that's been taken care of.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So three of our members in the Coast Division are doing a session next week on basically an introduction to how to do achievement in the NMRA. Cool. And, and one of these, I sent an email to Earl, like the 5 things that will get you more points, the 5 things that will get you less points, but it kind of an introduction to how do you do that. It's a great thought process. And I was thinking it would be something that might be interesting for the NMRA-X as well at some point. So.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
We'll do the intro between Earl and Gordy here.
Yeah, no, people are crying out for content about AP at NMRAX. There's a few issues that obviously generates lots of questions about remote assessment. We don't use the word judging, but remote assessment and the challenges that people face. I know Neil's in Hawaii, I'm in Orkney. He has better weather than me, but we have similar challenges in terms of getting things assessed. So yeah, it's good that there's been a few changes, but a lot of people are looking for information about AP, so anything anyone can contribute for AP type stuff to NMRX would be great. And I know there's a group of guys in Texas at the moment. Frank's not so keen on people using remote operating sessions as part of their chief dispatcher, which I think is a bit mad because I know people that got their chief dispatcher and dispatched the layouts remotely, but different, whatever. So we're currently working on that because there's a lot of people around the world doing remote operations now as a result of the lockdown. And there's guys in Canada, Australia, across the US. If you don't know if anyone's seen Dave Abelese's layout, Dave's one of the guys that's doing it. And so we're hoping in September to have a 24-hour NMRAX event, and while the event's going on, we'll be doing remote op sessions. Kind of like when you're at the National Convention and OPSIG's doing operating sessions. Well, we'll be doing remote operating sessions on the side that people can go and take part in, and we'll be cutting away and having a camera feed from the different operating sessions all around the world. So I'm hoping that that's the next bit, Earl, that we can work together to have the guidelines updated on in terms of remote operation. But thanks, guys, and thanks, James, for inviting me. I was halfway through my dinner, and I just ran to the beer fridge and jumped in here, so it's not a problem. So it's great to be here.
Gordy's in the other part of the world.
Yeah, he's upside down.
Yep. Cool. Well, that kind of brought us to the end of what it was kind of the organized. Let me throw up, by the way, just so we had a few folks come in a little bit later here. Here's just some info for updates for the rest of the month. So July 11th, which is next Saturday, 9 to 10, we'll have the PCR Achievement webinar that Frank, Earl, and Mike are putting together. That will be the same time as this meeting, but the Zoom address is actually different. It was set up as a PCR event, not a Coast Division event, so it was actually set up with a different Zoom account. So this is actually the Zoom address for next Saturday. I'll send this out in an email when I send out the recording of this session, and then I'll probably send out an email next Thursday or Friday about this. And then from 10 to 12, we're going to participate in the little thing that's at the right, which is a multi-division meetup, kind of trying to bring different divisions from different groups together to just have interactions, kind of like we did with Jeff, meeting new people. And there are 2 mini clinics that'll be part of that. One is Joe Fugate, who had built the Siskiyou line and is actually torn out and rebuilding it. And is going to talk a little bit about, what he's learned in doing a number 2 major layout. And then John Lawrence, we actually are going to have a different presentation, but there's an NMRA board meeting at the same time. So that actually got moved, and John Lawrence is actually going to talk about creating detailed cypress trees. And as you guys know, one of the things I've been playing with is creating really detailed trees using the static grass and that. I'm personally very interested in seeing that. So that'll be next Saturday. July 18th is an NMRAX all-day session that Gordy's setting up. It's part of that. I decided it's not worth us trying to have a meeting that day and work around it, because our meeting time falls in the middle of that, and then we have it in the evening, and I didn't get a lot of great reactions on Saturday evening meetings.
Phil, sorry to interrupt you. It's Gordy.
No.
It's actually, the NMRAX event's actually the 12th of July to the 18th every single day from 8 a.m. I know you guys are on Pacific time, but you can work this out. It's from 8 a.m. Eastern to 11 p.m. Eastern, from Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday.
That's Gateway, right? That's
Gateway, yeah. So that's 117 hours or something ridiculous like that of brand new content.
So basically next week, the week of the 18th, we're not going to plan on having a session that Saturday, because these sessions will continue. I put up here July 20th, we're going to have a Coast Division board meeting. I put that up for two reasons. One is for the folks that are on the board to know it's there. Also, I'm going to send out an announcement, and anyone who's interested in coming and understanding and getting involved, it's a good opportunity to come and see, you know, what we're focused on the board. Quite frankly, I think our primary discussion is going to be what kind of in-person events we can think about doing in the fall. So that'll be a discussion on July 20th. That'll be at 7 o'clock, and there'll be a Zoom meeting as well. And then we'll have another Coast Division Saturday meetup at 9 o'clock on the 25th. So that's basically kind of the schedule for the rest of the month, and we'll put something else out later. And by the way, down for anyone who joined late, on the bottom right, definitely looking for feedback. If there's anything you'd suggest we do differently, want to do differently, please feel free. And by the way, anybody can a great opportunity now for anyone who's got any great modeling. As I look at Earl always blows us away with his.
I'm getting
Earl,
ready.
so just out of curiosity, do you have handy your pile driver you showed us a few weeks ago?
Yeah, that got judged. So that got, I think, 101 points.
Cool. So for the guys that are on there from the other divisions, Earl's kind of our master modeler for building amazing structures and cool models. So I was going to get him to show off how.
Maybe we'll see about next week.
Next week.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you'll probably see him during your thing. So anybody else got anything interesting to share? Or?
Yeah, okay, one thing, 2 weeks ago, we had this Local 5 presentation.
Yes.
And I know you've been looking into it, but I've also decided that I'm sort of going to follow it up as much as I can with a taking an F7 ABA set and putting both Local Fi and battery power into the one, using the B unit as essentially the power source.
Yep.
And so it's just got started after that Local Fi, and sort of getting into that more different aspect of control. Part of my thing, of course, is if I could get rid of wiring entirely, I would do it.
Right.
So it's no more track wiring is my goal.
Are you going to do dead rail? Are you going to switch to like dead rail, like battery powered?
So we had the Loco-Fi guys come in basically 2 weeks ago, because we didn't have a session last week, and they came in and they presented the Loco-Fi Wi-Fi, call it decoder, where it's basically it's an app on your phone talking directly Wi-Fi to a decoder in the engine, and the engine decoder gets power from somewhere, and it can be DC or AC, like 7 to 24 volts. And by the way, as a techie guy, what got me excited about it was the idea that you were changing the channel from this really weird, noisy rail channel for data to Wi-Fi. And by the way, my head immediately goes to the thought, if you put a plug on this decoder, you can now plug in one of those drone cameras. You can now have video integrated with your operation. I mean, to my mind, the future opportunity of it was almost more interesting than the immediacy. But it's really cool because you can do a lot of what you try to do with DCC without having the base system cost of DCC. You don't have to buy, you know, a bunch of boosters and cabs and all that stuff. You just buy one decoder and run it from your phone. So the cost structure to get in was a little different as well. So it was just interesting to think about it as for folks if they were interested in it as an option. But that's, Ken, you're going to have to come back as you get it and try it and let us know how it works. And also see if you put one of those chips in that's, you know, that actually can take the rail power and charge the battery. So, you know, in other words,
yeah, I basically, I bought a used old Athearn ABBA set.
Yep.
So I have a bunch of, B units, and I can swap B units in an ABA.
Right.
So I can be charging one on a charging track and then just swap it into the set to continue the power.
That's an interesting thought. If you put plugs between the units.
Yeah,
Phased,
but I just need a 2-wire plug to the
right, you can
powered unit.
Right. So what you can do is you can have a combination of powered units and unpowered units. You plug them together, and the unpowered units get their power off of a bus for the train that comes from wherever the batteries are.
Now, getting to smaller locomotives like switchers and so forth, I am looking at their future development of a supercapacitor.
Yep.
They call this AMRAT module that would allow me, for instance, to have a powered section of track and then all of the sidings. I don't have to worry about the polarity or anything like that because I can just go off into an unpowered section and it gives me 5 minutes to do the switching.
Right. Yep.
Again, less track wiring. No more frog wiring. None of this sort of stuff. I'll never qualify for an NMR because I won't do the wiring.
It's interesting to think about how the electronics simplifies, right? So you go from, the days of, a dual controlled track where you had 2 cabs, or then you go to the more complexity some of the clubs had where they had 10 cabs with relays and everything. And you look at all that complexity to deliver the power, and then you go to DCC and the complexity goes, then you go to Wi-Fi, and now the track doesn't even have the signal in it anymore. And if you do some sort of dead rail, you don't even have to have power on the track. So we've actually gone from this real close association of the engines to the track to they're much less associated for the future. It's interesting. Anybody else got any other interesting modeling for the week? It's kind of quiet.
I've been busy, but I don't have anything to show. Basically, I spent a lot of time building a Owl Mountain flat car. And if you haven't built one of those kits, it's HO. You should. They're incredibly well put together, well designed plastic and brass and metal kit that injection molded plastic for early SP flat cars, F50 series. I think that's about it. I did have, you were talking about sanded grout, and
Yep.
I bought a can of it. I haven't used it yet, but I'm thinking about it.
So when I did it, I actually what I did was I basically put the sanded grout in some glue and then sprayed it with some water. But I put it on just using like a plastic spice thing that's got the little tiny holes in the top, and shook it. For dirt, by the way, one of the things that was that Luke Towan, he said take some sort of a can. I've got one of those old plastic orange juice things, and you put the dirt in it, and then you put a nylon, a women's nylon across the top with a rubber band, and then use that as a shaker, and you just get the fine dirt out. So it gives you a very fine layer when you put the dirt on. And I find that works really well too. I haven't tried that with the grout. I was actually going to try it with the grout, because what happens when it hits that nylon, it breaks the particles up really fine and kind of sprays them, and you get a real fine layer kind of falling down into the glue to give you that kind of nice base texture you want. It looks like dirt.
Well, so much of track that I'm building is going to be yard type track or non-mainline track.
Yep.
It's going to be basically the rails buried in the track, and I've been working on a method of using Woodland Scenic's foam sheets and so forth. First, I use that as the base layer, one layer of their HO thickness. Then I come along and use the N scale thickness to build up to over the tie side to make the top of the ties level on the sides of the track. and then just ballast, or in the case of this, use the grout to in the actual track itself.
Right.
So, but anyway, it forms like a trough, like an excavated trough, which actually, if you look at the way they build flat track, is the way a real railroad does it.
Yep.
They scoop out, and then they put the ties in, and then it fills back up to the level of the top of the tie.
Well, you know, what's interesting is when you get the point that was made earlier, is that as time went on, they basically did things to drain water away from where the ties were, right? So the idea, even though you could put it flat, you put it up a foot, that way the water drains away from where the ties are, and the ties aren't sitting in water, which I'm assuming if they sit in water, they rot a lot faster.
Well, I'm doing Port Costa, which is
Right.
up on the Carquinez Strait, and the flat part of the yard. Now, of course,
Right.
I've got the mainline tracks, which are going to be slightly elevated and are going to have actually very good drainage.
Right.
But the flat yard actually had years and years and years of ballast layers
Right.
down, and essentially the track on top of that it grew up over
They
the
just
time.
keep building it up. Yeah.
There was enough underlying rock to drain out of what looks like a flat yard.
Well, that's interesting. So that's an interesting thought. It would be interesting if you could to look at a yard over 50 years and see how much the yard had actually raised as they went through and refinished the track. Because what they tend to do with the track is they tend to lift it up and do underneath, and they push it back. And it may be that over time, they may have put the tracks 50 or 180 years ago on dirt, but then over time, they may have been lifted up 6 inches. So there's now 6 inches of ballast underneath them through the years as the track's been reworked every 10, 15, 20 years.
Actually, you find in some cases up to a foot of ballast or more if you were to core down.
Yeah.
Now, often in major yards, more modern railroading, they'd actually go back and re-scrape down to the lay new ballast and so forth. But we're talking about stuff as it was in the case of Port Costa in the 1950s, now 70 years ago.
Yep.
And what was done by the SP then, in terms of the track plant, the track portion of their plant was a little bit different than what the UP would do today with that same situation.
Yeah, that's the one thing I find is when you go back, once you get to a certain point, you can't get any colorization anymore. And one wonders about the colorization if you go back to the 1950s, if there were differences.
The look of steam and what steam did to the immediate surrounding of the track was different than, well, of course, what with diesel.
Right.
And it was pointed out, with diesel, you see that oil line down the middle of the track. Well, actually, I think SP, you saw that oil line from 1905 on.
Right.
But the fact is that steam would have it would tend to kill vegetation in and around a track that in a way that diesel power doesn't, and other effects on just the color and so forth. It seems to most cases be a lot darker than if you look at a flat yard today, particularly in the West Coast, and not like you see in my background, which is Siesta Pass after a rainstorm. It's very light colored. It's a very light tan. Maybe a little bit of orange in the tan or so forth, but it's a very, very light color rather than dark at all.
Well, but I think part of that was that if you look, especially on the eastern railroads, until the 50s, a lot of those yards were cinders.
Yeah.
I mean, I think they were weren't they using a lot of cinders still then in places? Because they still had the coal cinders all over the place.
Yeah. Cinder,
or other things like, I mean, it's an interesting question of why would things change? Maybe the ballast changed, or
for steam, of course, after 1960, you're not going to have any ballast, any new cinder.
that's right. So that would be the end of cinders. So when they finally got rid of steam between, say 45 to 60, which was, steam went away, the availability of cinders went away. So by 1960, wherever they used cinders before, now they had to use some sort of other natural ballast because they didn't have cinders available. And by the way, I know nothing about where they use cinders in yard. I just know they sell them. So,
well, California outlawed coal.
Yep.
In 1905.
which is probably why they're.
Ken, are you in Hawaii or are you in California? Or California? Can y'all hear me?
Yes. I think everybody here is in California except for maybe Neil.
Yeah, okay. I'm in Hawaii. Yeah.
I think the folks that are on here from the Coast Division, I think almost everybody else is a Californian.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So Ken's there. Ken's here in the Bay Area. And actually what he was talking about modeling is up on the Carquinez Strait, which is where from the bay, the water comes into the Central Valley. And up there, it's kind of the, I guess what you call the industrial heartland of California is that area where you have lots of ports.
It's certainly the oil and area, oil and chemical plants are all strung along that area from Richmond all the way through to Antioch. It's sort of the heavy industry section of the Bay Area.
Right. Everybody thinks about the Bay Area as being kind of high tech, but the reality is, if you go back in the 30s and 40s, in many ways, this was the manufacturing industrial capital of the West Coast. Is almost more than LA, because a lot more of that kind of industrial stuff developed here first before LA, because it developed when San Francisco was there and it developed across the bay. So it's kind of interesting. There's a very rich industrial heritage around, what, about a 20-mile shed of shoreline from Oakland up around to Carquinez, probably 20 miles of shore that's all protected and has a huge amount of different industries that basically interface to the ocean.
Yeah. So. For the oil companies, it meant they could bring oil tankers in and just dock them right up in front of the refinery. So often there wasn't as much crude oil coming in by tank car, so much as product going out.
You could ship product to LA easier by ship than trying to ship it overland.
Yeah. Well, that was competitive. For a long time, I worked for Crowley Maritime, and we used to do barging oil up and down the coast when it was a very price sensitive thing, because, just a few cents in the price change of the oil would mean whether or not you barged, whether you used a pipeline, whether you used a tank car or whatever.
Here, for the guys from the East Coast, let me share this. This is what we're talking about. It's kind of this is the area. Is if you look at it, it's this area here. That's all along. So if you start over here, this is the bridge. This is the bridge to San Francisco right here, to Treasure Island, San Francisco. This is kind of where Berkeley and all. But if you go from Richmond here and around this corner and up this way, you see this is all industry up this way where they get down to the water here. So it's a very interesting area of a huge amount of industry that people don't realize. We all think of this area as being Apple Computer and Google. There's a lot of basic industry that's still here along the bay. Gives you good modeling.
Also, you get if you really have fun, it intertwines. There's the former Santa Fe line and the Southern Pacific lines and the WP all of this in this area. WP really is, until 1930, Southern Pacific had to use a car ferry to take freight cars across from Port Costa to Benicia to get across the Carquinez Strait. And then in 1930, the railroad bridge was finally opened that gave them a full straight main line from Sacramento directly into Oakland.
Yeah, it's interesting because there were no rail traffic across the bay until the 30s. So before the 30s, everything was by barge.
Well, actually, no. The Dumbarton Bridge was built way back in the south end of the
south
bay.
end, but I'm saying they still from Oakland over like the SP, and there were still a lot of barges. I mean, it's for folks who are not from California. If you've never done it, it's really interesting to look at what's called the Beltline, the California Beltline Railroad, which was a railroad that ran in San Francisco that basically took cars from all the railroads that came into San Francisco. So basically you had the SP, UP, you had the WP, you had the Santa Fe, and there was I think at least one from the north, and they would actually bring cars by barge to San Francisco and then deliver them and they also had a rail line coming up the peninsula, but they would deliver them to the Beltline. And the Beltline charged per car to deliver it to a business along the waterfront in San Francisco. It's a really interesting railroad, and it's one Kaufman's got a great model up in Santa Rosa of that. That's
Southern Pacific only had a line. It was the only one who had a land connection to San Francisco up the peninsula. Everything else was by barge across the bay.
By barge or ferry. But it's an interesting thing. You can, if you look at it, you'll see this whole area of the waterfront where there are all these barge locations where the railroads brought barges in the yards, and they would hand them off to the Beltline, and then they would deliver them to the wharfs along the waterfront.
It is an interesting note. Later, when I worked for Crowley in the 1980s, we were taking the barges. We were the connection for the Alaska Railroad from Seattle to Whittier in Alaska, and it was done by barge. You'd take two barges of freight cars in a tandem tow across the Gulf of Alaska, and we never lost one. And 1,200 miles of open water.
So you're out there with those fishing boats that are fishing for the crabs and are all sinking. You're out there with those guys with barges of rail cars. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Oh, it was. Well, I actually was more involved with the North Slope development. And all of the material that had to come from the U.S., including, for instance, drill mud, would come by in a specialized cars from Texas to be taken up to Fairbanks by staying in the same rail car, and then finally offloaded into tank trucks that would drive it up to the slope.
Wow.
Fascinating time.
Trying to show this railroad. Can't do it. I'm trying to show a picture of a book called The State Belt, San Francisco's Waterfront Railroad, but the camera won't pick it up.
So the problem is your virtual background doesn't see that as because you've got your virtual backgrounds turned on, it doesn't see it as a face, and it eliminates it. So the only real way you have to go in and go in your video and turn off the virtual background, show it, and then you can turn it back on.
Okay.
Maybe if you get it close enough to the camera, it'll show it. But yeah, that's actually the book. Maybe not.
I'll try it further away.
Clearly the Zoom AI.
There it is.
There it goes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting. It's kind of interesting because I like narrow gauge, but I find that railroad to just be from a pure operational perspective one of the most interesting railroads because it's literally an entire railroad that all it did was switch cars. I mean, it never really ever builds a train. There's never really the concept of a train. It's really just the concept of, I've got 5 cars in the yard. They need to go here, so I need to move those 5 cars there.
Yeah, for Gordy's sake, It was also the running ground for the Flying Scotsman when it was in America and stuck here after Alan Pegler went bankrupt.
You could have kept it.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. They used to drive, so the trains back in the 30s, all the transcontinental trains ended in Oakland. And they had these thing called moles, which were basically piers built way out, like a mile and a half out into the bay to get closer to San Francisco. And the train would come to the end, and there was a station there, and then you get on a ferry, and the ferry would take you to San Francisco. But whenever they announced a train, like when they announced the California Zephyr, and they had the big ceremony, they drove the train up the peninsula on the SP tracks, got it over on the Beltline tracks, drove it up in front of the, come on, what's the name? The ferry building there down at the end of Market Street in San Francisco?
That's it, the ferry building.
They would park the train, which never came with people. They would park it in front of the ferry building and have the big announcement and take the pictures. So whenever you see the pictures of the announcement of the California Zephyr or one of the big trains going to San Francisco on the Santa Fe, the pictures will always be in San Francisco in front of the ferry building. But the reality is the trains never went there because they all terminated across the bay in Oakland. I thought it was a really interesting concept of how they did marketing back in the 20s and 30s.
The trains ended up in Richmond. That's where you went. That was the end of the line. That's where you picked up your grant.
Depending on what company you were on.
See,
That was the end of the Santa Fe.
I know.
No, it was an interesting time. I mean, I still think we realize how different things were then, right? It's hard to realize when I was looking at some things about the Sierra Railway back in the early 1900s, 1905, 1910. And, I think we realize is that, going 30 or 40 miles before automobiles were readily available was actually a pretty significant journey. It's interesting. I live in Pleasanton. And Just Trains is in Concord. So it's a 20-mile drive. And I don't think anything about, I'm going to run up to Just Trains because I need a couple of parts.
You have to have an appointment.
Well, now you got to have an appointment. But what I'm saying is in 1900, a 20-mile trip for the average person was a pretty significant activity.
You had the San Ramon Valley Railroad.
Right.
Which ran from Radom up to Avon,
Yep.
where it connected with the Mococo line, which would go into Martinez, a junction at Martinez, and from there to Port Costa. Interesting enough, Port Costa was the engine house for the San Ramon Valley. I live in Walnut Creek on the San Ramon Valley.
But railroads, people putting in railroads and having a railroad changed a lot economically for a community, for an area, right? Because so if you think about where the Sierra Railway runs from Oakdale up to Sonora, up in the mountains there. If you think about prior to the railroad, the only way you get from point A to point B was either walking, riding a horse, which meant you couldn't carry very much, or in a buckboard on a trail that probably had ruts in it that were 6 inches deep. And so if you start to think about your speed, you're not going to get more than a couple miles an hour. So the idea that you could go 20 miles an hour in a train and go from Sonora to Oakdale in 2 hours versus the day it would have taken you a year before was a pretty phenomenal change. If you think, I think it's hard for us to grasp because to us, we think about airplanes and all the things we do. But back then, only way you could get somewhere was to walk or ride a horse. The idea of the railroad was transformational. I mean, the Transcontinental Railroad, I don't know we did some stuff for the club, of talking about, we did some, prior to the Transcontinental Railroad, to get to California from New York, first off, it was much more difficult and much more dangerous to go from New York to California than from New York to London. I mean, if you wanted to go to London, it was a lot easier to get to London from New York in 1860 than it was to get from New York to San Francisco. Because you just want to trade across the Atlantic Ocean. To get to San Francisco, you had to go all the way around the Cape of the Horn down there, the Cape of whatever it is. And I guess like 5 to 10% of the ships sank that tried to go around there. Numbers were pretty huge. Or they dropped you off in Panama and you hiked across the peninsula and caught a ship going the other way, in which case, by the way, you probably died of malaria, 5%.
They're actually in the 1850s, someone built a railroad across Panama.
to do the same kind of thing. Yeah, but my point is, in prior to the Transcontinental Railroad, to go to California took at least 2 months, probably 6 months. And depending on the path you choose, between 5 to 15% of the people who did it died. Right? So if you chose going overland, there were like 60, 70,000 people that died trying to do that. And then all of a sudden, it was 7 days in a train car. I mean, you got to think about how transformational that is. We just can't even really understand it today. It's like us going to Mars.
Bring it back to model railroading. Hornby has recently reissued or built actually a completely new model of the 1830 rocket or 1826 rocket, which was used in the original English trials to determine what was a practical steam locomotive. And I'm not getting one because it will run on HO track, and because it's their compromise of 00 4mm scale on HO track. But it's an idea that you could actually start reproducing the rail equipment of the 1820s and start thinking about the real evolution when people all of a sudden got off the horse.
Yep.
You can buy that stuff in the UK if you want. There's manufacturers of it. You can buy Liverpool Manchester Railway kits in the UK in 4mm and 7mm, O scale and O. It's quite popular, but the trials you were looking for was the Rainhill trials, which were the trials at the midpoint between Liverpool and Manchester to prove which was the viable, reliable locomotive to run. And the other interesting fact is on the first day that the Liverpool to Manchester Railway opened was also the first day of the first railroad fatality, where a Member of Parliament ran along to the then Prime Minister, who was the Duke of Wellington, who was the famous victor over the French at Waterloo, and he went on the outside of his which was like an open mini gondola, to give it an American style, open wagon that they sat in. He went onto the side of the Duke of Wellington's carriage and to observe a passing freight train, which could only have been passing at 10 miles an hour. And unfortunately, he went on the door handle and the door swung open as he was hanging on the outside of it as the freight train passed, and it killed him. And that was the first ever railroad fatality of a passenger being killed by a train on the same day that it opened.
He was the secretary of the Board of Trade. Was it Heskinson?
Yeah, it was one of them.
So 180 pounds, but it's out of stock at Hornby.
They sold out in 24 hours.
But by the way, if you go online here, they're actually announcing. This was the latest one on 1/7/2020. They're actually announcing that they have third-class carriages. So that's a third-class carriage. So the first-class carriage is when the other picture, the nice little covered things. This is for the minions.
Second class has like this, only it had seats. Third class, you had to stand.
Yeah. So I guess these.
They didn't know. No, third class. They still exist. Those actual carriages still exist in Manchester. There's a museum called the Museum of Science and Technology in Manchester, in the central Manchester. I'm originally from Manchester, and my brother is also a historian who's just doing a year at Kent, but previous to this he did a year at York, which is where the National Railway Museum is. Those carriages, they still exist, and you can still ride in them behind a replica rocket if you ever visit Manchester. They run every day. The steam train.
So by the way, for everybody, right now the 2022 is the NMRA convention in the UK, and I think it's in Birmingham, isn't it? Or has that been changed?
It's been cancelled.
We've had to can that because of Yeah, so the Commonwealth Games, which is the ex-British Empire, the people that still want to admit they used to be part of it, they come together and have like a mini Olympics every 2 years, and it's going to be held in 2022. It was always going to be in 2022, but the problem is because the Olympics has gone back a year, they've pushed the Commonwealth Games back a month, and now it's exactly the same time as when the NMRA convention was going to be. So you can't get any. We can't get any accommodation in Birmingham, and they're unwilling to. The committee wasn't willing to change it to another city.
2023 is still in Dallas, right?
2023 is still in Dallas. There's talk that St. Louis may pick up 2022, and the UK, as far as I know, has the opportunity to pick up 2024. So because there's no one in for 2024, so everything may just roll back a couple of years. But we're in Santa Clara next year,
right?
Apparently, so yeah, hopefully it all goes ahead.
So by the way, the modules I put up earlier, those will be there next year in Santa Clara. So if you come to Santa Clara, you'll be able to talk modules.
I'm going to start a GoFundMe page. GoFund Gordy to Santa Clara. Don't worry.
Yep. No, it'll be fun.
Hopefully, I'll have the dead rail version of an my F units running by then on somebody's modular layout.
Yeah, I was looking forward to the UK NMRA. I've actually been looking totally separately. They have these things called narrow boats in the UK. I don't know if anybody's ever seen these. So basically, they took all the canals they built pre-railroads, right? It's kind of an interesting transportation thing. Before railroads, there were canals. And because the UK actually started much earlier than the US, the UK had a lot more canals than the US. And yeah, Gordy, it's kind of like putting a cat video up. Children are terribly attractive.
She's terribly attracted to NMRA meetings, unfortunately.
That's good. That's good.
But,
she's got good taste.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But yeah, narrowboats were still used when the railways existed.
Yeah, but what they did apparently back in the 50s, there was a bunch of people got together and they pushed the government and they basically repair and maintain all these old canals. And you can buy or rent narrowboats and you can travel. If you've never seen them, go on YouTube and look some of the videos. And I was actually going to try to get some folks together and take a week beforehand and rent a couple of narrowboats and travel around the canals there around Birmingham. If you've never seen it, it's really cool. You're in a boat and you go for a mile or two at a couple 3 miles an hour, and there's like 7.5 feet wide and like 50 feet long, and they're like only like 7 foot tall. So they're like little narrow things, but inside they'll have a bedroom and a little living area and a kitchen. And you basically just trundle along the canals and see the British countryside. And then you come to locks where you have to pull it in and you close the gates and you lift it up and then you come out and go to the next one and so on. It's pretty cool. I thought it'd be a really interesting way to do a vacation, something that would be interesting in the UK if you were there.
It's a very slow way to do it. But yeah, you're limited to 4 miles an hour.
That's right.
You're right. A canal boat on the inside is 4.5 feet wide. The bit you can stand up in, and they're up to about, the longest ones are about 70 feet long, but obviously the cabin's not that long. And there's still working boats on the canals because one of the things that they used to make just north of Birmingham was pottery, and you hear about parts of the UK being referred to as the potteries. Well, that was just north of Birmingham, and what they realised is that if you bump shunt a wagon or a freight car full of pottery, it has a nasty habit of turning back to clay. Or bits of pottery. So what they did is they kept delivering right up until the 70s pottery by canal barge because it was smoother than road or rail. Away from the trains. Well, out we go. And it was only the advent of air suspension on trailers that they moved away from the canal boats. So there are still working boats on the canals. If you're ever in the UK, it's feels right. It's worth having a trip, even if it's just a day trip on some of the canals and seeing some of the heritage.
And by the way, if you like machinery, they have two different elevators in the UK. There's one that was built like in late 1800s, and it's two troughs that are 80 feet long and 9 or 10 feet wide and 4 feet deep, and they fill them with water, and they basically go back and forth, up and down about 50 feet. And so you pull your boat in, you're 50 feet up in the air in a trough, and it drops down to the water, and you pull out down below. And then they have another one that's a big wheel that turns around. It's pretty amazing machinery that they use to kind of implement this stuff. Totally different than railroads, but you can actually, it's really interesting how much you can see the evolution and thought process from using a canal as a path to carry goods to the idea of rails as a path to carry goods. And you can almost see the intellectual thought process that guys had in their minds when they made that transition. It's very interesting.
Hey guys, it's Neil in Hawaii. I think that the canal boats are also really popular in Germany and Holland, aren't they?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, Europe. Yeah,
Holland in
Europe.
particular.
Yeah, all over the continent, but Holland, yeah, you're right.
And
I think that would be fantastic, yeah.
French canals. French canals as well.
Yeah, they've got the right idea though. They're wider canals.
Right.
Yeah.
The problem with the Brits was that we realized we were like, oh, really great idea. Let's build all these mill towns. And then we went, oh, it takes ages for a horse and cart to move these goods. We need to build a canal. And then we have to try and squeeze a canal, basically a big ditch down between buildings. So our canal system is very narrow. But the Dutch and the French systems all connected into their river system. So you can do river cruises. You're into it, you can do canal and river cruises over there.
The 18th century machinations of landowners either to get a canal or to fight a canal are a great part of fun read in English history.
It's like, it was interesting. When I was reading about the Transcontinental Railroad,
Yeah.
and when they laid out the Transcontinental Railroad, it turned out that a curve got you 30% more land because of the right-of-way. They got X number of miles on either side of the right-of-way. So if you went straight, you got this much land. If you went like this, you actually got more land. So it turns out, and by the way, it turns out by the end of the Transcontinental Railroad, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific owned land in the United States equivalent to Texas. I mean, literally they became the largest. It was the largest. The U.S. paid them to build the railroad and land, and the amount of land was huge.
Yes, and we know about 1980s when SP Land sold all of it off for
right
to the wrong people.
Got it sold off. Yeah, I mean, it was a very interesting thing about it. They were talking about how there were decisions made where the railroad went less about what was best for the railroad itself, but more on the land that came with that decision to where to put the tracks.
Or the overlap in Utah where there were hundreds of miles of a CP and a UP track that went past each other.
Because they were just trying to get land. Yep.
Yeah.
It was pretty amazing. But
are we about 11 o'clock? So
we're probably at a good time to call it, unless someone else has something significant. Again, next Saturday, you're going to get an email invite from me that'll come out on Friday. It will have details for the 9 to 10 achievement meeting with Earl and Mike and Frank. And then it'll also have the details for the 10 to 12 multi-division meeting, which will be a separate Zoom, but we'll just jump over to it at 10 next week.
That will be with Europe. That'll be with Europe and Salt Lake City.
Yeah, Europe, and it's with the divisions that were on that thing, and I'll send that. When I send it out, I'll send out the invite. You'll see what it is. I think it's, again, like with today with Jeff, I thought it's really nice to get folks that are different from some other divisions and give some good cross-reference. And by the way, if anyone wants to do some presentations, Gordy's doing things. St. James NAB has set up the multi-division things. We may participate in another one of those into the August timeframe. We'll see what happens as a group. So, well, with that, I wish everyone a great week. We'll see everybody next Saturday with Earl and Mike and Frank.
Yep.
And good modeling. Stay safe, and we'll see you in a week.
Hey, thanks everyone for putting this on.
Thanks. And thanks again, Jeff. We really appreciate it. It was great.
Yeah, great presentation, Jeff. Really appreciated it.
Adios.